and I think some sense was made of some things going on. You know, you just get up in the morning and you try some more. That's my philosophy about this job description. It's like, okay, yesterday didn't work so well. What will we do today to see if we can get it to work? Although now it looks like I'm in Albany because I'm on the Capitol staircase, but truthfully, I'm not in Albany. I'm here in New York City this week. Let's see.
We'll keep your secret.
Well, maybe I can change to my home. Let's see, choose virtual background. Let's go to no virtual background. There I am.
Ah, there you are.
All right. For better or for worse, my home office. Whose cute dog am I looking at? Lori Boris.
She does have a cute dog.
Yes, she does.
Cookie used to join us in our in-person meetings. Good old days. Well, if you're ready, Craig, I can go ahead and give the little pre-meeting readout, and then you guys can get started.
Yeah, yes. Why don't you? I'm hoping we get a few more members. I'm surprised we only have 3 others besides Alita and myself at this point. Huh? I know some people are busy campaigning tonight.
Well, there's a lot going on. The day before a fairly big election, yes.
So welcome to everyone. If this is your first time joining us at one of our virtual committee meetings, you'll notice that you're muted, and you're going to remain muted throughout the meeting except for whenever the committee co-chair or the task force co-chairs, Alita Camp and Craig Lader, except for, sorry, whew, man, long day. Okay, you'll notice that everyone is muted except for the 2 co-chairs and our presenter, Liz Kruger. Following the presentations, as we go through the agenda, the co-chairs will call on members of the public who wish to speak. If you would like to participate, you can go to the reactions icon at the bottom of your screen and press the raise hand button there. Not the wave or the thumbs up, those will disappear and we'll miss you. Once you press it, only press it once. If you press it a second time, your hand will go back down. If you're calling in from the phone, it's *9 to raise your hand and *6 to unmute. Once you're called on, be on the lookout for a prompt asking you to confirm unmuting. The chat is available for technical support only if you're having a problem with Zoom. It's not to ask questions of the presenter or the co-chairs. They will never see those chats. If you're using an older version of Zoom, you will need to go to the participants section at the bottom of your screen, or you'll find the raise hand feature there. And finally, please do not raise your actual hand or wave it at the screen because we might not be able to see you and we might miss you. So chat me if you have any questions. Otherwise, I'll hand it back over to the co-chairs, Craig and Alita.
Great, thank you. Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Craig Lader. I'm one of the co-chairs of this Congestion Pricing Task Force of Community Board 8 Manhattan, along with my co-chair, Alita Camp.
Hi, everyone. Good evening, and thank you for joining us.
And we are very honored tonight to have as our guest Senator Liz Kruger, who represents the 28th Senate District. She is also the Senate Finance Committee Chair, and that is very useful for this conversation that we are going to be having tonight about congestion pricing. For those of you who may be joining us for the first time, this task force was largely formed as a result of many of us on Community Board 8 and many people within the community having many questions about what congestion pricing really means and how it's going to be implemented. And the decision was made, I believe, Alita, it was your decision to form this task force to allow us to have a focused conversation, to be able to raise any questions and issues that we have and try to work with our elected officials and governmental agencies to try to ensure that we have some input into the process going forward as congestion pricing is about to be implemented. So with Senator Kruger here, it presents us a great opportunity to get any up-to-date information in terms of what's happening on the state side, which is especially important because this process is largely being driven by state legislation that was passed in the 2019 budget bill and and the fact that this is going to be administered and operated by the Metropolitan Transit Authority, by the Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Authority, or MTA Bridges and Tunnels, which is one of the MTA entities. So with that, Senator Krueger, if you want to say anything to begin this discussion,
Sure.
that'd be great.
First of all, thank you for inviting me. And I won't pretend I'm the world's expert. Hopefully anything I present will be accurate, but you'll point out if I'm wrong and I'll go back and learn more. So basically, as Craig just said, the state did approve a congestion pricing program about 3 years ago now, with lots of details not worked out, but to be worked out in the future by a traffic mobility review board. But we also required federal sign off on this plan, and they did not give it to us during the Trump administration. So really nothing was happening. But then very recently, the feds under President Biden did give the state sign off that allows us to move forward with the congestion pricing proposal. And there's a full expectation that that is what the MTA intends to do. And again, lots of details were not completed. So the biggest outstanding detail is that supposedly the Traffic Mobility Review Board will be the entity making the decisions, but there has been no appointments made to a Traffic Mobility Review Board, hence it doesn't exist. I wrote a letter back in May with many of my elected colleagues pointing out to the MTA and the governor that nothing could be moving forward until there was such a board, and that we fully expected it to be following open meeting laws to allow the public in to see the discussions and decisions being made, that they had made earlier commitments to us that there would be public hearings, particularly for people who lived in the zone and would be impacted more greatly than most others. And that, of course, had not happened because there was no timeline and there was no Traffic Mobility Review Board created. The TMRB, which is that long name, Traffic Mobility Review Board, is supposed to comprise one chairperson and 5 members, one of whom is appointed by the mayor and the rest appointed by the MTA board / Governor Cuomo, though 2 members, so it's a total of 6 members, but 2 members must be one from the Long Island Railroad and one from Metro North service areas. So it will be 1 Long Islander and one from the region north of the Bronx that encompasses, I think it's 7 other counties. The TMRB can issue recommendations for how congestion pricing is supposed to work, what it will cost, and who will get much desired exemptions from the toll recommendations. But the final approval of these recommendations come through the Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Authority. So, what is in the plan by law? I will list them out in a minute, but highlight that any additional exemptions or changes, again, will go through the TMRB recommendations and TBTA, Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Authority approval. I will be giving you a test at the end of this presentation tonight, just kidding. So what is specifically in the law? That the zone will start at 60th Street and go south. But one big issue that I know matters to us here in Community Board 8 is if you are living north of the zone, but attempting to leave the city by crossing the 59th Street Bridge, are you going to actually be expected to pay to travel into the zone when you're really only turning a couple of corners to get on the bridge? 2, passenger vehicles will only be charged once a day upon entering the zone. So if you have a private car, if you leave the zone and come back and you've paid once, you can do that as many times you like during a 24-hour period. You're only going to get charged once a day. Emergency vehicles and vehicles carrying people with disabilities are exempt from these charges. Those living below 60th Street, hence in the zone, and making less than $60,000 annually will receive a tax credit equivalent to what their annual costs for coming and going from the zone would be. And the amounts not yet set, but are expected to be between $11 and $14 per passenger car. But there's also an assumption that it's very likely that there will be higher cost and lower cost depending on the day and hour you are heading into the congestion zone, because again, the intent is dual. It is raising revenue for the MTA and decreasing traffic congestion in the zone. So there's a logic, and it has worked in other cities, where you make the cost higher in the busiest periods during certain days of the week and hours of the day. And then in the less utilized, less congested periods, you may lower the cost for you for going in and out of the zone, going into the zone. 80% of the revenue from congestion pricing fees will go towards city transit improvements for the MTA, including new signals on subway lines, at least 150 miles of track work, and thousands of new subway cars, electric buses, and other items specifically for New York City Transit. An additional 10% of the revenue earned will go to each of the two major suburban commuter trains operated by the authority. So 5% will go to the Long Island Railroad and 5% will go to Metro North. This plan is expected to generate $15 billion over 4 years. So the TMRB and the TBTA, in evaluating exemptions and discounts and pricing, need to make sure that they are not decreasing the estimated needed revenue of $15 billion over 4 years. So basically for every exemption or discount or reduced charge, they have to factor in what they're doing to make sure they don't fall below the $15 billion target. I'm happy to try to answer any and all questions you have, but I think that's the basics that we know up till now.
Thank you for that summation. And I'll just add, for those who may not be aware, Community Board 8 has passed resolutions requesting members from Manhattan and points north of 60th Street be appointed to the Traffic Review Mobility Board. We'll see if that happens.
Oh.
But Aleda, did you want to say anything?
No, just that we find it hard to believe that a plan that affects so much of Manhattan could conceivably not have Manhattan residents on it, and where there's such a variation between above and below 60th Street, that there wouldn't be someone from each of those districts would be really surprising. But I have some questions, but I'll wait until everyone else goes. So Craig, let's see if there are any questions from the public. I see Julianne Britannia has her hand raised. Will, would you unmute Julianne?
Yeah, and I'll just remind everyone that they can go to the reactions icon at the bottom of their screen and click the raise hand button, not the wave or the thumbs up. Those will disappear. So Julianne, go ahead and unmute.
Thank you for the great presentation and for your time today. I have heard sort of this district, and I'm here representing Treadwell Farm Historic District. And as you may know, we start on 61st and we go to 62nd between 2nd and 3rd Avenues. So our direct community has certainly raised to our council member, Keith Powers, that we'd love to make sure that we understand how we will be impacted, because to your point, we are just on the other side of the zone. And under Giuliani's administration, when, you know, our neighborhood, the Queensboro Bridge had a change to the pattern, it immediately caused a lot of chaos for our direct neighborhood. So I'm just want to make sure that community members, as Alita mentioned, are involved at some of these roundtables to be able to have a say and have some influence on, you know, how we may be impacted and how to alleviate some of these impacts. An example that we've seen in the past in this neighborhood is, you know, and I don't know what will happen now with Ubers and Lyfts and all these other things, but in the past we became a parking lot for people that didn't want to just go in the zone. And to your point, Senator Krueger, I don't know what it means when you said private vehicles, if these Uber cars are considered not private vehicles, if they have the T or not. Obviously they're more or less resident, looking like regular cars, but I don't know if they've made a decision on how those vehicles, which have really impacted our city in terms of the number of traffic vehicles on our streets. I don't know if you have any comment on that, but I am a little worried about, you know, private cars that may be livery cars parking along these residential areas or trying to find spots and just, you know, waiting for pickups.
Okay, so the Ubers and the liveries and the cabs are defined as private cars for this purpose. They may actually even get charged more, but they are not going to be exempted from these requirements. Now, they don't necessarily aim to park anywhere because they only make money when they're picking people up. But as far as making sure that they are not idling somewhere while they're waiting for a call to come in for them, you know, is a realistic concern pretty much anywhere we're living nowadays. And so I think enforcement is the great frustration of anything that happens on our roadways. I think we all can share in that. Yeah. I find it amazing that, you know, Ubers think just sitting in their car on fire hydrants somehow isn't breaking the law because they're just waiting for another call to come in. It's like, so I actually tell them to move. Sitting on fire hydrants at any time, whoever you are, unless you're fire truck putting out a fire, not only is illegal, but it's actually quite dangerous for anyone living there, hoping they might actually get a fire truck to show up if needed. So, you know, so those kinds of issues are very real issues. As far as the parking just outside the zone, I think what probably will happen, the first few days, everybody will be running around like crazy looking to find themselves a parking space on 62nd so they don't have to drive in the zone. Then they will discover what you already know. There are no parking spaces. And so they will give up on that great effort and go back to an alternative plan. Because remember, the purpose of congestion pricing is partially to decrease the number of vehicles driving through Manhattan and driving through the zone, including, although that wasn't your question, but I should mention it, in incentivizing trucks, which we're going to be charging much more to not go through Manhattan if they don't actually have pickups or deliveries in Manhattan. Because if you follow truck traffic and congestion, which is a huge portion of congestion, it is large trucks cutting through Manhattan, trying to avoid certain routes where they have to pay for bridges and those tolls. And so they're not coming to Manhattan to pick up anything. They're not coming to Manhattan to deliver anything. They're just cutting through from east to west or west to east or north to south to avoid certain tolls. And if we can actually target them with a fairly expensive cost to drive through the zone, the traffic planners tell us we will see far fewer trucks on our streets who didn't actually have a reason to be there in the first place. So I take that as a very positive thing that can come out of this.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Evelyn David has her hand raised. Evelyn and Will? Evelyn's on the phone.
Evelyn, it's *6 to unmute.
What? Did you unmute me?
Yes,
Yes.
you're unmuted.
I can hear you.
You can hear, okay. Good evening. Oh, thank you very much, Liz, for coming. This is wonderful to hear your voice and the clarity of all this. I beg to differ a tiny bit about the trucks, as they're basically double parked up and down Lexington Avenue delivering things, but they really are delivering things. So they're not just wandering around.
Well, some are,
And the
you're
trucks
absolutely
going, right, yeah. So some of them going through, we always say to ourselves, what is he doing, right? But maybe he made his delivery and then it is going home. So I don't know. All of that, the truck thing, I didn't really think about so much. The one thing I am really waiting for, and I've called your office a few times actually, is the Manhattan meeting, the public meeting, where we'll actually be able to get up and voice something in front of this traffic mobility review board, maybe, if they're actually going to be listening to us. So that's one thing. The other thing is, on the last debate, the candidates all said, we really don't want to discuss, they were asked a question about congestion pricing, and every single one of them said, we need Manhattan to get going again before we inflict something else on people trying to get back in to go to work. So I know it takes a while to get things implemented. So maybe the city will be back in order, you know, back a little bit more active before this gets through. And the other thing is, below 60th Street will actually save a huge amount of parking spots on Park Avenue between 60th and 61st. However, going and coming off of the 59th Street Bridge, people get off, they can go onto 60th Street, they can go across. What they're going to do is go up the east side. If you made this, and I know this is like revolutionary, maybe to your ears, but if you made it below 57th Street, they'd be able to get off the bridge from Queens, go over to the west side garages, park, get on the subway, go to work, turn around and come back and go back on that's only the lower level on 58th Street, and you'd have to make it below 57th Street to get them back on the upper level. Now, I know that you guys all of you are kind of on the 60th mark line, but it's an idea. We've been talking, last community board, we kind of started talking about this because we know what a nightmare it's going to be. We already know. It's going to be very difficult. And I do live right here, right on the border. And I do have a car, and I don't use it every day. I'm a teacher. That's the other thing. My fear of teachers never coming back to the city, finding other jobs because they can't get in. So just many things to think about, right?
There are always many things to think about. I don't think the committee can change to move it to 57th, by the way. I think that was legislative, although legislation.
Why? It could be below 57. Yeah.
No, I think it has to be at 60th. But I'll double check that. I actually think your point about we shouldn't be rushing this when we are trying to reopen Manhattan and understand what has happened and what will happen. That is important. And considering they haven't even named a committee, it's not like the committee's out there meeting with us, holding these meetings and hearings, etc. So they're already quite delayed. Your point about will there still be trucks on Lexington? Of course, and on 2nd and 1st and 3rd.
Yes.
And because, here's another reality we saw expand during the pandemic, and I suspect it won't change that much. Everybody decided to shop online, which meant everybody's retail is being delivered to their home, which means there's more vehicles per building in New York City than I ever imagined I would see in my lifetime. We're debating legislation right now in Albany, which I mitigated quite a bit, but I didn't say no to, of allowing FedEx and UPS and Amazon to actually use what they call these 3-wheeled electric bike with devices behind them to carry the packages.
Cargo bikes.
What are they called? I'm sorry, Craig?
Cargo bikes.
Cargo bikes. Thank you very much. That is the word I was looking for. And the large chains of truck delivery companies believe that they can replace one major delivery truck with 2 cargo bikes per day and dramatically decrease the number of trucks on the roadways. I don't know whether it's true or not. There are European cities that have gone this route, and the City Department of Transportation has actually been doing a pilot in Midtown for a couple of months now, and they say it's working very well. Now, when they say Midtown, they're talking about the 40s and 50s between Park and the West Side. So I don't know that we've seen it here yet. It's different, but they've been piloting it, and I know we need to do something to decrease the number of trucks on our streets every day. So I'm worried / quasi-optimistic the cargo bike model might be helpful, but that will also create problems, as we know.
Yeah, right. Very quickly, and I will get off. On Lex, Amazon has huge amounts of packages and 20 people working for them with carts that are filled way high every day. Okay, just to let you know, in this area, just to let you know. Okay, so as far as, but that's this area. That doesn't mean where you're talking about. Maybe Amazon has figured out that they can do it with these bundles, right? Because it's not. But when people get back to their office, I don't know. It's not. It's a different living situation, you know. So they're delivering to people all over the place. The Amazon truck on Lex in this neighborhood particularly. I know, I see them every single day. I think they take up an entire area, right?
Yes.
So
but
somebody, I don't know what DOT is looking at, but anyway.
So we will see whether, I don't think
the
Senate passed the bill dramatically modified from what they originally wanted. And I don't know that the Assembly passed the bill. So you might not be seeing these cargo bikes right away.
Okay. So the Traffic Mobility Review Board, will they be the people that we will be standing in front of when the public meeting happens, if it ever happens?
Correct.
It's a question.
Yes.
Okay. And you'll let us know. You will post it and shout it from the rooftops.
Yes, we will.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Just before we go to the next person, I want to mention that the last congestion price task force meeting, there were a lot of concerns raised about the northern border of the zone around the 59th Street Bridge. And maybe it's possible when you go back to Albany with it to think about a zigzag approach, because otherwise people can't get on the bridge without going to 58th Street. And so they'll be taxed or tolled just to get on the bridge coming from uptown. So that's something we're not sure that the legislature consider, or that that was considered in putting this forward. I just wanted to mention that it was raised by a number of people.
Yes, and we continue to raise it as something that, to be honest, we think it's quite easy for them to adjust for, and simply not charge you if that's what you're doing.
Right. And if I could just add, the language of the law actually stipulates that central business district tolling will not include the FDR Drive, but does include the approaches and ramps in the geographic area below 60th Street, meaning that in theory, it could include the approaches and ramps to the Queensboro Bridge. So, because technically the bridge itself is below 60th Street. So that's, I think, an add-on question to this whole topic. In addition to accessing the Queensbound bridge, what does it mean to exit the bridge, depending on where exactly you're exiting, and what does a ramp mean in this case?
No, I agree, Craig. I think you must need to sit there with it mapped out in front of you and with the members of the board and explain what it means, what we're talking about.
Yeah, that's what we're seeking clarity on.
Yes, I understand.
Thanks. I'll do the next public person, Craig, is Marilyn Ezes. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that, but you know who you are. Will, would you unmute her, please?
You did a wonderful job of pronouncing it correctly.
Thank you.
Senator Krueger,
Yes, Marilyn.
to what extent, or is there something in place that the state officials are going to be interacting with city officials in terms of implementation and enforcement? At this point, as someone who is very interested in public safety and traffic patterns, there seems to be a lack of enforcement and a lack of understanding where various responsibilities have changed. At one point, it was I'm in District 4, and it was the police at one point, and now it's park enforcement and all that. And one issue that came up, and I wonder if you could answer it. I was at a community board 8 meeting with Parks Department, and there was concern mentioned about e-bikes. And the person from the Parks Department said, yes, we're aware of the problem, but we have no answer. I mean, that isn't exactly what he said, but that was what he meant. A couple of days later, I'm listening to Mayor de Blasio, and someone from the West Side complained about the e-bikes and what a public hazard they are. And Mayor de Blasio said, well, they're allowed by the state, and I don't know what we're going to be doing about it. I called your office and I was told that e-bikes are not allowed. And I think it's the lack of information that is making many New Yorkers unhappy and afraid.
So e-bikes is a moving target, Marilyn. So probably when you ask that question of each entity, it was a different point in history, which has changed quickly. So e-bikes were not legal to use until about 1.5 years ago, when at the city's request, the state did change the law. So the city council and the mayor said, we do want to have e-bikes, and we want you to change the rules such that they can ride in the bike lanes, and they have to meet certain standards. And so while I'm not a fan and I voted no, just FYI on that bill did pass, and electric bikes did become legal in New York City. Now, part of the storyline, of course, is there were so many of them on the streets already that people wondered if they were actually illegal, because there was this storyline where it wasn't illegal to buy or sell an e-bike. It was just supposedly illegal to use an e-bike on our streets. So now they are, certain kinds of them are legal. And I say certain kinds because, like you probably have also noticed these e-bikes some days have morphed into motorcycles without license plates. And those are a different kind of vehicle, and those aren't actually supposed to be defined as e-bikes. Or even electric scooters. Some of us think electric scooters are something you stand on with a stick and are a child scooter that's been electrified. And then you learn that companies are selling these things that are the equivalent of mopeds and calling them electric scooters. And then people are riding them in the bike lanes, which they are not supposed to be doing, because those are actually vehicles that should be licensed and on the roadways. So we're living in an era where things are changing rapidly, and more people actually not only want to bike, but they want to use e-bikes to get around the city. And they make the argument that it decreases the number of cars on the road and is environmentally more sound. And I'm actually sort of betwixt and between, because I hear from people in all different directions, and I see city government wanting to change laws perhaps faster than I would prefer, but that it is happening. And I do exceptionally worry about pedestrians who you know, think you come to a corner and you look both ways and you look for the trucks and cars and bikes not to be, the trucks and cars not to be aiming at you, but you don't necessarily focus on the fact that in between when you step into the street and when you cross the street, you also may have to get through multiple layers of regular bikes and e-bikes and whatever other kind of vehicles are going to pop up very soon. And I worry very much that it's very complex to even cross a street at this point in Manhattan. But I don't think any of this is going away or changing. But I don't think it relates to congestion pricing per se. And somebody's going to tell me to go back to
If I may,
congestion pricing.
if I may, just to continue for a moment. It is all part of people really being afraid of this. And I would like to read just a couple of sentences from a presentation at Roosevelt House by the Families for Safe Streets. And it's mentioned that last year.
With congestion pricing, because if it doesn't, I'd respectfully ask that you could just hold off on this discussion, and I'll put in a plug for our Transportation Committee meeting on July 7th, of which I'm chair. And we've invited traffic enforcement from the 19th precinct to appear to specifically discuss bike enforcement. So I just don't want to take up time and the valuable time of the senator to talk about e-bikes tonight. I don't know that that applies to this discussion.
I absolutely understand what you're saying. I just wanted to ask a specific question because we have a member of the state with us. And it was said that last year, 931 people were killed in crashes in New York State. And it cost the economy at least $15 billion. And in New York City alone, at least 243 people died in traffic crashes. Now, what the senator has said, and very appropriately, is that people can't be sure when they're going to cross the street that they're going to get to the other side safely. And I just wonder to what extent this becomes not only a city problem, but a state problem. And it really has to do with enforcement because people are not following the law.
Yes, enforcement is a huge problem and I think is worthy of its own meetings and discussions. But apparently there is one scheduled very soon, July 7th, you said, Craig?
Right, July 7th is our Transportation Committee meeting. And Will, have you confirmed that traffic enforcement will be attending?
They have not responded, but we will follow up.
Okay, our intent is to have them there. We've been meaning to have this discussion for a few months and our agendas are always jam-packed. So we've been aiming for this month. But if not, it's our top priority to have as soon as traffic enforcement agrees to attend our meeting.
But we really do need to stay focused on congestion pricing. So the next person from the public is Alexa Hirsch.
Hi, my name is, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Alexa. I am an intern at Assemblywoman Rebecca Seawright's office. And although I'm not asking a question on her behalf, I'm asking a question on my behalf. So I do live below 60th Street. I live on the corner of West 4th and Charles, so very, very west, but I do go to Columbia University. So I'm curious about, I don't know, I mean, this might just be like a me thing. I do sometimes, if I'm having a late night, if I feel a bit uncomfortable on the subway. So I'm wondering how congestion pricing will affect the price of like an Uber or a cab from like 116th and Broadway down to below 60th Street. Thank you for listening.
So I don't know the answer yet, Alexa, because it is true that cabs and Ubers will have to pay towards congestion pricing, but the recognition that they might be taking, 20 trips within and out of the zone in a given day is going to be reflected in a different pricing mechanism for them, so that, if you're the unlucky passenger with the first trip into the zone, no one believes you should get the full day's charge on that fare, as opposed to the 15th person, so you get no charge. So it will be a formula where they just pay X amount each time, but I don't know how much that will be.
Okay.
It's something for you to watch out for. But then it's also an interesting question. If they're bringing you home into the zone late at night, the assumption is that would be a lower cost time of day to be going into the zone.
Right. Okay. Good to know. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
All right.
Senator, do you know if this is the motivation behind the initial phase of the congestion pricing law that included the surcharge on for-hire vehicles, including taxis, that is actually in effect for all trips below 96th Street as opposed to 60th Street?
You know, when they did it, we all said that, like, how did it become 96th? But the governor slid it in that way for revenue, and that's where it stayed.
So will that be removed when this is implemented?
No, I do not believe it will.
So we'll have double, I mean, the price of an actual taxi ride is a fraction of the taxi ride when you put all these fees on it. So there will be a double fee for people below, one fee below 96 and then another fee on top of that below 60th.
That I'm not sure of yet. That's one of the great questions out there about how will they handle the pricing of the various kinds of vehicles, because if there was a taxi advocate here in our meeting tonight, they'd be pointing out, hello, we won't even exist soon because we're all being run out of business by these companies, Uber and Lyft, who intentionally are driving us out of business and then will skyrocket their costs to use them once there are no more cabs. So I actually think when you talk about for-hire vehicles, the city and the state and perhaps this entire country have yet to get our arms around how these different, what they like to call themselves disruptor models of liveries are radically impacting the cab industry to the extent that in some parts of the country, you actually can't find a cab anymore. Yeah. So I think that's a really good question, and it's really tied into, again, a series of things that are happening that are far more complex than congestion pricing.
Right.
We are concerned about, I'm sorry, Craig, we are concerned about those taxi fares and what it's doing to taxis. And I think there was a recent article, something about an Uber from Kennedy Airport costing $248. We know taxis are regulated to whatever it is that they charge by the city, which is, again, a mere fraction of that. And that's something, once you start imposing all of these fees, I think there is a lot of concern on the community board for the taxis.
And we've already passed a resolution opposing and requesting that the state take action to reverse the congestion fee south of 96th Street for taxis in particular, because of how unfair it is for city licensed vehicles and authorized vehicles to be subject to the same fees as private entities such as Uber and Lyft. And I can tell you from experience, just this Saturday morning, when I was looking for a cab and as a backup checking out Uber and Lyft prices to go from 87th and Madison to 80th and 2nd, the Uber and Lyft prices were about $20 for that short trip. And I was trying to help people who were mobility challenged get from one location to the other. And I just was in shock over how expensive it was. So part of the issue as well is post-COVID, there aren't enough taxis right now. They're only operating I don't even know if they have half of medallion vehicles out on the roads right now, which is part of the issue here. But that's neither here or there as relates to congestion pricing. But I just want to note, as far as I can tell, there's no language regarding exemptions for taxis and for-hire vehicles in the congestion pricing law. So I guess that ultimately becomes a traffic mobility review board issue as well.
Yes, it does. But as you are all pointing out, I think we all know, like, we really need to take a hard look at how we are handling any kind of regulation of for-hire vehicles in the city of New York, including what they are allowed to charge, what kind of fees we put on top of it, and how it's all sort of gotten away from us. And we need to understand what the impacts are because they're huge.
Right. So we don't want it to be an unintended consequence of congestion pricing that we lose the taxis.
Right.
Aside from being iconic New York, it just also has to do with fairness and the inability to raise those kinds of surge prices. So thank you for, I know, once again, looking out for New Yorkers. I don't see, is there anyone else from the public? And Craig, if you'd like to call on the board members, that's fine. Anyone else from the public?
I don't see anyone else from the public at this moment. If anyone does have a question later on, feel free to raise your hand. But in the meantime, we can go to board members. So first we have Lori Boris and her puppy, maybe?
Getting back into place.
Don't forget to unmute, Lori.
Hi.
Hi.
My puppy, who will turn 13 years old this week, is hiding under the couch. So anyway, hello, Liz. Thank you very much for coming here. I wanted to say that I do support the concept of congestion pricing, because I do think that we just, for a myriad of reasons, we need to reduce the amount of cars that are coming into our city. But with that being said, the devil is always in the details. So I have a couple of questions. The first thing is, you gave us a breakdown of where the money is going to go, but there seemed to be 10% that was left out of that formula. Where does that extra 10% go?
I wrote myself a note in the margin saying, where does that 10% go? Because I also noticed that at the same time. So there's two possibilities. One, it was actually 10% Long Island, 10% north of New York City,
okay.
Or there's 10% I have to find. So that was my assignment for after the meeting, and good call, Lori. I was thinking,
right.
Oh, maybe I'll just get away with this one because I don't know the answer right now.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Another question is, when we talk about this 59th Street and 60th Street, thing, I support, I don't remember who said this, but when they said, why can't they just do it on 57th Street? I mean, because, but I realize that this has been, legislated from the state. So I don't know if it can be changed, but I think that it's possible, and correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't it possible for them to, like, I'm assuming that they're going to, and I'm not a traffic engineer by any means, but I assume they're going to put up like the toll things that just kind of read, your Easy Pass or whatever it is as you're going through to do the charge. And isn't it possible in the directions, like if you're going out on the 59th Street Bridge, then obviously you won't get charged. But
Right.
if you're coming in on the 59th Street Bridge and you're making a left, then you would be charged. I guess the question is if you're making a right, but don't you come in? Don't you come in on 60th Street on the way in?
Yes, you do.
Yeah, so that
maybe only affects you if you're going out, and we don't charge you going out. See, that's why I said everybody needed to sit down with the,
right.
with the maps and figure it out. Because I do know when it was decided that it was going to be 60th, that was in coordination with quite a few of the, traffic and congestion advocates, including Sam
Schwartz.
Sam Schwartz.
Sam Schwartz, yeah.
And I believe it was actually Sam Schwartz's recommendation that this be the streets. So we can definitely go back and look at that again, because it wasn't an arbitrary decision, and it certainly wasn't a decision where legislators sat around and said, yes, 60th, no, it's 57th, yes, 59th and a half. We weren't the ones doing it. Okay. So
all right, and just one more thank you. And one more question, and this is just a question which I'm sure probably hasn't even been decided yet, but you said that they were going to make exceptions for for people who were disabled. And so, my question about that is, how will they tell? Is it going to be are you going to have a license plate that says you're disabled, or are they going to do it with a placard that says you're disabled? Because those are two different things, and that word needs to get out to people who are, some people have a placard but they don't have a license plate, or vice versa. Go ahead.
I'm going to take the leap that it'll be license plate, because as far as I know, all of these systems for reading your car and billing you or easy passing you are correlated to your license plate. But it may be that there's newer technology that doesn't require that, and it may not mean you have to have a disabled license plate. It could be that you have a car with a license plate that is then registered as for a disabled driver and can be used even if you're a placard car. So that will be its own set of issues, I can guarantee you. As disabled vehicle parking has been its own set of issues forever. We're here in New York City. We make you go to a specific group of doctors to sign off on whether you're eligible for disabled placard or plates. And out in the suburbs, pretty much your dentist can write you a letter saying he needs disabled parking. So we actually have two sets of laws in the state, one for the city, one for the suburbs. And lots of suburban people complain bitterly that they can't use disabled parking in the city. And we're always like, well, you can actually go through the city doctor and be approved as under the disability rules for the city, and then the vast majority of those requests disappear. But so I suspect this will be its own confusing assignment also.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I really appreciate your doing this, and
thank you.
We'll check back with you.
Good.
Thank you, Lori. Next we have Sharon Pope Marshall. Will, if you can unmute Sharon, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you so much for being here, Liz, and really navigating this discussion for us. So I just wanted to touch bases with you regarding that 10%. It's coming to me.
The 10% that's coming to where?
Me.
10%
directly to Sharon's pocket.
Yeah, no one seems to know where that 10% is going. So I just want you to know that it's coming to me.
Well, mazel tov for you, Sharon.
Thank you for clearing that up, Sharon. We really appreciate it. And I'll be Daily News every moment.
Exactly. But I do have a couple of questions.
Sure.
I don't have a broad sense. I don't need an exact sense, but a broad sense of when you think this might be implemented overall. I mean, it's, is it like 3 years from now? Is it 4 years from now? Is it 2 years from now? Just a very broad sense.
These are the great questions in government and philosophy. How long does it really take anything big to start? I was told the state was reviewing contracts with the companies that set up the devices. And so once they've picked one, hypothetically, it doesn't take that long to operationalize all of this. And yet we have we're going to have a new mayor, and they will need to pick their representative, or I guess the old mayor could be picking the representative. We might have a new governor around the same time. One never knows in Albany lately. And that will be a change of representatives and a variety of things. We're dealing with the MTA's chair / executive is leaving, Pat Foy, and the Senate needs to confirm. The governor wants to break it up into 2 positions again. And a lot of us are wondering, why would we do that? We just in 2007-8, we went through all these public hearings where it was recommended the two positions be combined, so it would be less confusing as to who was in charge and who was making decisions. And so now the governor wants to change that back, and we're pushing back on that. We're hoping to have some public hearings just on the redesign of the MTA and what everyone's thinking about. So lots of things hypothetically could happen before this group of 6 is even appointed to do their work. I'd say 18 months would be a really short time frame.
Mhm.
But again, we were put off, a good 2 years because of Donald Trump, and we are looking for the money. I mean, not to be subtle about it, there is a need for more capital money to keep the MTA afloat and modernizing, although knock on wood, we got for them, it was two $9 billion allotments from the federal government since the pandemic started. So I think that was $18 billion, which is money we did not expect to see at all. So it has shifted the dynamics somewhat of the fiscal crisis of the MTA. But then, of course, everybody stopped using it. So then it didn't have any ridership, which reduced its ongoing money coming in. You know what? Don't bet any money on this at all, Sharon, but I would think 18 months is the shortest time frame.
Okay. My second question is, and thank you for that information. Since President Biden had to give permission for this to move forward, is it possible for a new president to rescind that, even though I know I now have a sense that it's going to be up and running and in place for a few years at least. But just in terms of process, I wanted to have some idea whether or not a new president could rescind or stop congestion pricing in New York City.
From a legal perspective, I sincerely have no idea. I didn't really understand why they had the right to stop it in the first place, but apparently Donald Trump could prevent something from being signed off on that prevented us from going forward.
So Liz, let me tell you,
Yeah.
after 2020,
Yeah,
I'm not taking anything off the table these days.
well, that's true. And certainly it is true that an enormous number of things that are done at the local level can be superseded at the state level and then superseded at the federal level. So if a president really woke up one morning and said, I hear they have congestion pricing in Manhattan and I don't like it,
Exactly.
I'm not say they couldn't come up with a reason to stop it. I hope our presidents will be busier with other things than to insert themselves on local traffic and tolling, but maybe they would.
Can I give my little interpretation?
Yeah, and I just had just one quick comment regarding cargo bikes.
Yeah.
Just to pull back the curtain a little bit, there is a sensitivity of delivery companies vis-a-vis the trucks, especially Amazon and others in terms of their impact. And they have reached out to Bike New York. So I want to just put on my Bike New York cap for just a moment to teach their drivers, if you will, of the cargo bikes, how to do so safely, and confidently, as well as teaching the rules of the road. So I just want you to know that overall, that process has begun, and that these cargo bikes are not going to be just placed helter-skelter in the city without there being some level of bike education, and Bike New York has been engaged to do that.
Thank you.
So Sharon, let me just provide a little context. As a transportation planner, I'm familiar with some of the federal processes in place.
Okay.
And I can say it would be very, very unlikely that a future president would be able to rescind it once it is actually implemented. And the reason for that is it was delayed because the Trump administration was put on hold the federal environmental review process that would be required for this process to move forward. It's not that the federal government is opposed to tolling of roadways or tolling of districts. In fact, they've been supportive of that for many years, and there are many federal grant programs through US DOT, through the Federal Highway Administration, to support such projects. It was, I think, more of a vindictive reasoning behind the delay for congestion pricing being moved forward in New York. But once the environmental hurdles are crossed on the federal level, then essentially it just becomes an implementation process that takes place. And then once it's up and running, unless the federal government were to do a complete 180 and essentially bar any roads or districts in this case from being tolled, it would probably, I don't even know if that would be able to take place via executive action, or if you'd need some law passed by Congress that would prohibit toll roads from even existing, or tolled areas. So I think it would be extremely unlikely for something like that to happen. I don't know, Senator, you would.
No, I buy your argument, Craig. That's just fine with me.
Okay, I appreciate that clarification, Craig. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, I do see a member of the public has their hand up, Leah Hanlon. If we could just unmute you.
I unmuted. Thank you. And Senator, first, I really like to thank you for Dawn of your office helping me get my second vaccine shot a couple months ago.
Excellent.
After getting my first shot in a different state. But regarding, I really do thank you. But regarding congestion pricing, forgive me if I missed this at the very beginning of this call, but what happens if nobody goes back to work in Manhattan, in Midtown, or if fewer do, or if we have more pandemic, God forbid, and people are just working from home? What happens to congestion pricing?
So the bad news is there would be fewer people driving their cars into the zone, at least from a, well, I'm not going to say bad news. It would be bad news for revenue from congestion pricing. It would probably be very good news for everybody who lives in Manhattan to have less cars driving into our city every day.
It would be really bad for Midtown and all of the businesses there.
Well, it would, you know, again, it depends. So if they're taking the subways or the buses in, fine. If they're simply not working in Midtown at all, then it's all kinds of questions for planning for the future of Manhattan and planning for the future of Midtown. And congestion pricing would just be a sidebar story to, I think, the much bigger story. So people aren't coming to work in Midtown anymore. Where are they going? If they're going to newer buildings in other parts of the city of New York, probably not a crisis. If they're all working from home most of the time, a radical change in how our economy works and what kinds of buildings and office space are needed for it to work, but also a radical change. There's already discussion of whether some of these older hotels will ever come back or be needed as hotels again and what they could be converted into. There's already discussion about some of these, they have A, B, and C level office buildings, and C level office buildings ought to be converted to something else. So I'm not going to tell you it's not serious to be confronting if this is what happens, but I think the truth about New York City, it's gone through a lot of changes in the history of the city, many times none of them expected. And what we're pretty good at is figuring out how we redesign ourselves to be what we need to do next. So, great question. I don't have the crystal ball. There are certainly plenty of people talking about, do we need to be planning for a different city post-pandemic, because some of these things we took for granted as patterns of how and where people would be working are changing and maybe not changing back. Those are great questions. And I think the evidence right now is really mixed, because on the one hand, we're hearing people aren't coming back to work. And on the other hand, there are more building permits going in for new building of non-residential construction than in a really long time. I still have super towers being planned and approved by the Department of Buildings all over Midtown Manhattan. So somebody thinks it's still worth building and they will come, and maybe they will all be wrong and have spent a whole lot of money building new super towers we don't need. But I think it's too early yet to know.
Great, thank you.
And let me just provide a little context in terms of what's actually going on with traffic conditions compared to other modes. I have been tracking on a regular basis how the transit system and transportation network has recovered from its lows during the height of the pandemic. So as of last week on weekdays, last week subways were down 56% from their pre-pandemic levels, buses 40%, Long Island Railroad and Metro North around 60 to 65%, and bridges and tunnels, MTA bridges and tunnels, those that have easy pass tolls, which don't only include Manhattan, which obviously include in the outer boroughs as well, only 4%. So even if some of that activity is taking place in the outer boroughs, it's indicative of the fact that congestion has certainly returned, and that automobile use has recovered quicker than other modes of transit. So it's probably unlikely that you're going to see a large impact in terms of people who are driving and a lack of drivers that would impact the amount of revenue that could be obtained through congestion pricing, just based on how things are recovering and are likely to continue to as we move forward. But you can't predict the future, I guess.
But Craig, if I may, we don't know whether the change and the decrease in usage of public transportation is because, and the increase or back to pre-pandemic levels is because people are not wanting to take public transportation. Because then if the same number of people took public transportation, then those kinds of car numbers would indicate that Manhattan was thriving again, and it's not yet. So it could be that all of the people in the cars are because they don't want to be on the buses and trains yet, whether they're just local subway or commuter rail.
Right. It could be a combination of factors, and I'm not trying to speculate as to what it is. I was just pointing out that in terms of actual data, that it's automobile vehicular traffic that has recovered much faster than any other mode.
And I'm not even sure I would use the word recovery, because it's not necessarily an increase or back to pre-pandemic levels of people in their cars. It could just be because that with the reduction in ridership of public transportation is a smaller amount of people coming into the city. If we had the subways and the buses back to normal on the same cars, then we'd know that Manhattan is recovering. But right now, I don't know if it is recovery or just people who are driving in for some reason and not using buses and trains. Maybe it's just a language question. I don't know. And I don't mean to take up time with this. It's just, I think we still don't know enough, and we don't know enough about which buildings or which offices are reopening and where people are going to be working and what's going on with converting to residential buildings from those office buildings or hotels or homeless shelters or supportive housing or, and all the new construction. So it's confusing. I won't take up any more time on this, but it's such a big question mark that one of my questions for the senator later is, would it be possible to just put everything on hold for longer and see what's going on with the city, and to enable it to recover better without additional fees? But I'll hold off on that.
No, and I take your points to heart. But just compared at the height of the pandemic, bridge and tunnel traffic was down 70%, and now it's basically recovered to pre-pandemic levels. That was my point in terms of the use of the word recovery.
Fair enough. Thank you.
I only have about 10 minutes before I have to leave.
Okay. No.
I'm sorry. It's this thing called the night before the election, and somebody wants me.
So let's have Michelle and then Russell.
Okay. Hi, Michelle.
Yes, thank you. And Liz, thank you very much for being here. I'm not a fan of congestion pricing. Many of you know that from my comments in past meetings. But let me ask you this. While one of the aims of it was to reduce traffic congestion, we understand that. But the other, and to my mind, primary aim was a revenue stream for the MTA. And now that the federal government has given the MTA billions, as per your prior commentary, can we really assume that this is even needed anymore?
The money
is there any possibility of it being permanently put on hold, because the revenue issue, to my mind, has been pretty much solved?
So the revenue problems are not solved. We have short-term money from the federal government, but we have an ongoing out-year deficit for the MTA. So the money is needed. One could argue there's another way to get it, but nobody's succeeded in that yet.
Yeah, that was what was going to be my next comment,
right?
Is to examine other revenue streams from the MTA, including better management on their part. But anyway, go ahead.
No, I sincerely don't think anyone should imagine we're not going forward with congestion pricing, whether you like it or you don't like it. I think it's here, it's coming. If it's coming a little slower, and if there are good reasons to argue for it to be slower so that we can bounce back to whatever our new normal is, I don't think that's an unreasonable proposal. But I simply don't think it's realistic that you would see it going away. And the cities around the world that have implemented have actually found it to be quite valuable in both assignments, in sincerely reducing congestion in the most crowded center city areas, and in bringing in an ongoing revenue stream to pay for mass transit, public transportation, which we know needs to be the goal for us to improve upon for endless reasons, for the city to have a future, for the city to have environmentally sound travel, so that, I don't know, maybe we can hold on to planet Earth a bit longer and decrease the amount of damage being done by fossil fuels to us all. So I think it's very likely we are doing this, and hopefully we are doing this in the least damaging ways possible.
My next comment is in terms of the cost, what what each entry to the zone would cost. And I believe that in London, I have good friends over there, but just as an example, that when it was first implemented in London, it was one price. And I believe now it's about 3 times what it was originally. So I think, part of the issue is coming up with a realistic cost that people in the outer boroughs and people who really need for business to come in and out of the zone of all income levels, that they can actually really tolerate. But as we always say, the devil is in the details, and it's been very frustrating not having the details. From the first moment that this concept was thrown out, we all had a million questions, but there were no answers. And it seems that there may be more answers, or maybe a mechanism has been put in place to get the answers, but that we still really don't know exactly what the impact will be on the city, on all of the people who will be using these zones of all income levels. So that's been a big concern to me. So I hope we can get that information before this actually comes to be in the public hearings that I hope will happen. But thanks very much for your enlightening us tonight. We know more than we ever did now.
Thank you, Michelle. Yes, certainly we all like to know more. I will just point out London's had theirs in effect, I think, for well over 30 years now. So I'm guessing that, everybody's pricing did go up quite a bit over the 30, it's more than 30 years. My sister lived in London 30 years ago, and they already had congestion pricing then. So maybe 35 years they've had it in London. So, but it's coming. Okay, just because I have to keep going. Next question.
Okay, before we go to you, Russell, I hope you don't mind. There's another member of the public who has not yet raised her hand, and that's Wendy McCaver. Is that right, Wendy? Will, would you unmute Wendy? And thanks, Russell.
Okay.
Wendy, you're unmuted.
Hi, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much. Senator Krueger, thank you so much for making such a cogent explanation of this. I don't even know whether to call it a proposal or impending law or what, but I wanted to make just a few comments, and some of them have already been hinted at by other people. There's nothing probably worse than a science wonk who then went to law school, and that's me. So I'm just going to say that in science school, we learned that garbage in equals garbage out, which means that data collection is key and accurate data collection is key. So the first thing I would want to know is what audit has been done of the MTA to know exactly what they need and what needs to be spent and where the money has gone in the past, because there have been reports from time to time of surpluses that get buried and such. And so that would be the very first thing I would want to know. The second thing is I live in CB8, and I've been proposing that we have air pollution, air quality monitors for pollution in our neighborhood in various locations, and we can't get that going. There really isn't a good standard of measuring pollution on the street level and knowing what traffic is creating here. But we are way, way down. And I'm going to just give you anecdotal evidence that, when I walk around Midtown, the traffic is certainly not the way it was in 2019. And we may get back there, and this may be a very important concept in terms of controlling traffic and congestion and creating a revenue stream. But as it stands now, it is not. There needs to be a really serious reevaluation, and also based on census data of how much population is lost. In my experience, the cars and pollution that are the traffic stoppages that are created are largely by these constructions of these monster tolls, and by the city zone data that causes 67% of all our climate change pollution, and by independent studies it's 75% of all climate change pollution, and everything else, cars and every other thing, light industry, every other thing that happens is about 25%. So, or 33% if you're looking at the 67 number. So looking at it as being kind of the great, and as we get electric cars, that number certainly is decreased. So in terms of being the savior of our atmosphere, everything of course helps and counts. The motorized bikes do not help. So I wanted to put that out there, that we need better data. And the other thing is that I happen to live in an area in CB8 that has the largest proportion of mobile and sentient seniors, of which I hope to become one, and also moms with toddlers and strollers, and I was one. And we're very sensitive to traffic and to e-bikes. I know that's partly the province of another committee, but we need data on that. In fact, as part of the East 79th Street Neighborhood Association under Betty Cooper Wallerstein, a lot of us did endeavor to take primary data by stationing ourselves at certain points and measuring bikes and motorbikes and e-bikes and such, and seeing how many observed traffic regulations. And so we also need to have enforcement. The last thing I think I want to focus on is that we have a very fabulous and robust and relatively new social responsibility committee in CB8, and the most recent report and resolution regarded facial recognition technology and how it's misused on people of color and especially women of color. And there was a tremendous amount of concern that with congestion pricing and photos being taken, that this could potentially be misused, which is, just all kinds of problems and all kinds of wrong. And I know I dumped a lot on you, and thank you so much for listening, but I'm hoping that there could be better data before we're really talking about implementing anything, because right now we're kind of going on a wing and a prayer on something that wasn't highly audited in 2019 and before then. And thank you so much for listening.
Thank you. Well, a lot of comments. I'm not sure how many questions, but so the MTA is now putting its data up on its web pages. So there's actually far more data on the MTA and their expenses and their income and what they're spending it on. So I would encourage you and anyone to go on and to start to try to get answers to questions you might have from that. The city controller and the state controller also have the authority to audit the MTA and have done a variety of different programmatic audits. I do not disagree with you that they are not nearly, the MTA is not nearly transparent enough. And there are rightly endless questions people can and should be asking. I do believe that any punchline will involve they still need more revenue going forward to meet their capital expenses and their operating expenses. On the others were a bit more statements on different things that I could agree or disagree with, but I won't right now because they're not really about congestion pricing. Again, is it the best answer in the world? Probably not. Is it likely to go forward? Yes, I really do think it is likely to go forward. And what we perhaps ought to focus on is how to make it the most sensible we can. As far as the, are people using devices and cameras and other tech equipment to track us without privacy? Those are real concerns in today's world. I don't believe any of the systems they are looking at for congestion pricing are actually taking a picture of you, the driver, but rather they are tracking off of the license plate.
Thank you. Russell.
Thanks. I guess I have a question about the cargo bikes. Or is the idea that cargo bikes would be exempt from the congestion price? And if so, is there a way to adjust that? Just because it seems to me that, to the extent these things would be on the streets, they would take up as much, room for purposes of congestion as a truck would. And if you've got multiple of them instead of one, it seems like that doesn't solve anything. It makes it worse to the extent you're going to incentivize that. And if they're going to be in bike lanes, that seems very dangerous to me for a whole host of reasons we don't have to get into here. And the other issue I think that they raise is to the extent that you've got e-commerce more likely to use these things, if it's exempt, then you're basically providing a massive subsidy to e-commerce providers at the expense of potentially small businesses that are going to be using trucks. And so I don't know if there's a way to have these treated as, subject to the congestion price or not, but I guess that's my question.
That's an excellent question. I know that nobody even knew such a concept existed like 3 or 4 years ago when congestion pricing was being developed. But now that we know it does exist and it's going to expand, I think that's a really great question. Shouldn't these vehicles also have to pay into congestion pricing? They, in theory, will be in the bike lanes, Russell, because that was one of the real concerns I had, that they will make it impossible for regular bikers to be in the bike lanes because they will be the width of the bike lane. You won't be able to get around it. They will have to go no more than 12 miles an hour because I really felt strongly that they couldn't be allowed to go fast because they had much more weight on them. So if they don't stop in time and they hit you as a pedestrian or as another biker or as a mom with a, a child in a pram, bad things could happen. So we didn't want them to go fast. But that also means other bikes can't get around them. They're supposed to be parking in parking spaces when they are delivering or when they are reloading their product. City Department of Transportation has offered them some loading dock type areas on the streets in the Midtown pilot area and say they want to do that. But you're right, they are using our streets, our lanes, as if they are a car or a truck, who we do charge for parking now and for moving around if congestion pricing and when it happens. So that's a really fascinating question that I think we should all start to maybe build into the testimony we're giving at some point. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks again for being here. I wanted to add my thanks also.
Absolutely.
I just would like to add to that about the cargo bikes, and then I have a monetary question for you if Craig doesn't, is that if bikes aren't able to go around them, then the unintended consequences are that bikes are going to be on the sidewalks, which is something that we want to avoid. So that's something to really consider. My monetary question for you is that I recall, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that when they instituted the lottery, the justification was that money would go to education and enhance the budget. But someone who actually sells lottery tickets told me that the money is going into education, and this is what I'm not sure about, and an equal amount or somewhat equal amount is coming out of education and going someplace else. So it's not really enhancing or supplementing the budget. And what I'd like to know is what ensures that the revenue from congestion pricing is actually going where it's supposed to be going, which is to the MTA, and that the state government won't be pulling any money if it's doing that now from the budget or from the MTA budget, or taking it out because now we have more money going to the MTA. And if I'm saying anything that's wrong, I do apologize because I don't know. And I'm just kind of asking and making assumptions that maybe I shouldn't be making.
So the lottery money is mandated to go towards the schools. So it does not go to the general fund. It goes to a specific fund for education. But the great question always has been, if you didn't have approximately, I think we get about $1.5 billion from the lottery nowadays. If we didn't get that $1.5 billion from the lottery, would we be putting another $1.5 billion of tax money into schools? And the answer is probably, because when you survey people in the state of New York in all 62 counties, public education keeps coming up on top of what they want their money invested in. So it is a bit of a substitution effect. And there's been, over the years, built in more what they call maintenance of effort requirements so that the state government can't swipe education funding over here because it got lottery funding over there. But these things sometimes do happen in fiscal emergencies in particular. When the congestion pricing deal was going forward, that was almost an obsession of people's concern that the state could not take the money. And so that's why it's actually put through what is defined as the closest thing to a lockbox you can come up with, because the money will actually go to the Bridge and Tunnel Authority, which is off budget. And so it's actually pretty hard for the state of New York or the governor of the state of New York to swipe the money out of the Bridge and Tunnel Authority for any purposes other than what it's mandated to exist for. Never say never, because there has never been a lockbox that's actually been breakthrough proof, with the exception of Social Security funds. Every other funding at the federal level, they've figured out how to undo the lock boxes at various times other than Social Security. But we tried to get as tight on that as we could. So that's not worrying me so much.
Okay.
And I really do have to leave, and you'll have to be angry at me then afterwards, but.
Can't possibly be angry at you. All we can do is thank you so much for your time and your patience. Sorry for having stolen some of your time in the discussion.
No, that's okay. It was a great discussion, and I will absolutely let you know whenever I'm learning anything new about congestion pricing going forward. So.
And if you could just let us know if you hear anything about the status of the required traffic study that's supposed to occur in advance of this, to inform the Traffic Mobility Review Board for all their decisions, that would be really helpful. And if you can find out any information as to who the MTA is reporting to on the status, so we then have a better sense of who we can badger going forward to try to get answers.
And actually, Craig and Alita, if you just like to drop me an email note after this meeting of anything you want me to follow up on this, that would be great.
Thank you. It'll be more like a treatise, perhaps. But thank you so much for coming, Senator. We are always grateful to hear your expertise and your common sense. So thank you. Have a good rest of the evening.
It's great seeing everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll echo Michelle's applause. Craig?
I was going to say, I guess, do we have any other old business or new business that anyone wants to bring up? And do we want to discuss next steps? I think there's a lot to digest from this discussion.
Next steps is always good, but I don't know, pending the formation or the convening of that Traffic Mobility Review Board, it's hard to know. Maybe we could push for the concept of pushing back the time frame until we have a sense of where New York stands in terms of recovery, because well, first taxis, and then also just the larger picture of New York. If we're trying to get people to come back, imposing fees at a very fragile time may not be the best thing. I don't know, just an idea.
Yeah, I think that could be an option. I think there's, as I said, I think we need to digest this and schedule a follow-up meeting and see where we land with that, and see if we can get some of the, if Senator Krueger can follow up with any responses to some of our questions.
We don't have a July date yet, so we should meet again in July, and then we could look at it then. I know Russell and Michelle have their hands up.
Yes.
Well, Russell, you had your hand up first, so Will?
Thanks. So I wasn't sure if you meant next steps for this meeting or next steps in general for the task force, but I guess I have ideas. I mean, I think, first of all, what Liz said is that we're still 18 months out from congestion pricing being implemented, which is a pretty long time. And you know, if it were up to me, it would be longer. It would be, you know, indefinite, but that's a separate issue. But, you know, ultimately, I think it's going to be tough to argue that we need to put it off sort of longer when it's still 18 months out, or at least it's tough to make that argument now, right? And I think in particular, because we don't know what we don't know. I mean, to say we still don't have answers to a bunch of questions that are scheduled to be answered in the future to address something that's going to be implemented even further in the future, I think is just sort of speculative at this stage. So I think there's still, you know, and the other thing is, I think in general, there's still plenty to discuss, you know, beyond that. And I also think, you know, I'm a little bit sort of feeling like we're past the point of kind of strategizing about, you know, how to stop this, which I think asking for further delay sort of feels like. And, you know, we passed the resolution that we passed at the last meeting of this task force, and I voted for it, but it didn't pass the board. But regardless, even if it had, you know, I think the point here is, you know, the question of congestion pricing or not, I think is sort of behind us. So I think, you know, the issue is what to do about it. And I think there's plenty of issues that, you know, can be addressed. And my suggestion would be to say that, you know, at coming meetings, I think we've already given some thought to what the sort of overall kind of topic areas are going to be. I mean, one of them that really springs to mind is parking, right? So that could be a subject of a whole meeting. I know we don't know yet what the plan is going to be, but maybe to have a meeting to sort of talk about what what the challenges are. I don't even know if we could get into sort of preferred scenarios, but just sort of laying out what our issues are in terms of parking and having a discussion about that. And then, we could also have discussions about other similar issues that are going to come up. I mean, it was touched on, Wendy, addressed the issue of cameras and so on and so forth, and generally how that whole process is going to work. But it seems to me that the whole enforcement in terms of just crossing the line is a whole, topic area that could warrant a lot of discussion. So I think there's plenty of stuff to sort of have, as the meetings are coming up, monthly or bi-monthly or whatever the case may be, there's plenty of stuff to sort of schedule as this is going to be about this or that's going to be about that, and kind of take it from there, it seems to me.
So
I don't disagree that there's not a lot of different topics. I'm sorry, Craig, but I will disagree that 18 months is a long time out. We don't know where and how New York is going to recover yet, and the imposition of fees and the unintended consequences. And I'm sure that there are going to be some from congestion pricing on top of New York's recovery, where again, we don't know. They estimate 10 million tourists this summer. That would be great, but we don't know if that's going to happen or any of this. So
we're going to know that within the 18 months.
We're going to know that probably in the fall. With the conventional wisdom is that come September, that's when you're going to see the next natural spike in terms of people really returning back to their offices and
schools will be open,
beginning pre-COVID routines. Us in the transportation planning world believe that that's when you're going to have additional growth beyond what you're seeing now. And anecdotally, we hear that a lot of offices are planning on calling their employees back with more regularity. Now, the question becomes, if remote work does become more commonplace, and if it becomes a 3 days a week proposition for people to be in the office, then naturally you're going to see fewer people coming into the office. But that doesn't necessarily suggest that the city may or may not recover to the extent that it's anticipated. These are the types of things that are all just pure speculation, and everyone may have their best guesses, but no one's really going to know how that's going to play out, because we've been surprised before, even throughout this pandemic. And I mean, we hope and pray that it doesn't get worse again, and that could affect things. But assuming that things continue on this upward trajectory, we've seen just over the last month, as restrictions have been removed, just a very visible change in terms of the city and people returning to activities and economic activity. So we don't, and some people are saying that's happened faster than expected. So it's really hard to know. I was going to suggest that, and I've been saying this all along, I think, and this goes to the parking discussion as well, if we can find someone from New York City DOT who can perhaps speak to us about the potential implications of congestion pricing on parking and other regulations that are controlled by New York City. So essentially everything aside from the tolling mechanism and the tolling policies, where I'm talking about all the ancillary elements such as street regulations and parking regulations, loading, commercial zones, those who are interested in residential parking permits, all those things that DOT and the city would dictate policy. I think it would be helpful if we could have someone who can speak on authority to be able to help us have that discussion, be able to answer questions as to what is or isn't potentially feasible in terms of approaches or requests.
Or what they need to be able to make those determinations, because unless they know that traffic is circling beyond 60th, 61st, 62nd, and maybe going up to 86th Street, they're going to have a hard time, I would imagine, formulating parking principles. So maybe they need more data, and maybe we could ask for more data. But whatever it is, why don't we in July think about doing something with parking issues? And then certainly parking leads to one of the questions that Wendy raised, which is air quality. Because if you got cars, gas-driven cars and trucks circling around looking for parking, it's going to increase pollution and raise some questions about air in that area. I know it was a big concern around, you know this, Craig, too, from the CAG, that it's a big concern around the MTS as well. So just the increased pollution potential. But before we continue a discussion, we have a new board member who I know I'm going to not do well with the name.
Rit Agarwala.
Rohit?
Rit. He goes,
Yeah.
you go by Rit, right?
Rit is fine.
Rit.
Thanks.
Sorry, so sorry.
No worries. No worries. Thanks. I guess, two observations I've got. One is I feel like throughout this conversation, there's been I think we've failed to recognize the benefits to this district that congestion pricing will bring. I mean, for example, while yes, there's a potential concern, although having studied the London congestion pricing system in great detail, I don't think it's as big as it is often feared around people looking for parking around the border. The reality is that whatever air quality impact there could be at that point is vastly overshadowed by a comprehensive reduction in the number of cars driving through the district. And so I think, we need to be careful, I would argue, to, not to miss the forest for the trees and to recognize that, in fact, getting this system up and running, I would argue, I wouldn't wait the 18 months if we could. I think it's far better to have New York's recovery shaped through a congestion pricing mechanism that gets people back onto transit first, rather than inviting them to take their cars, feeling like the traffic isn't as bad as it was. But, watching the traffic and being a driver myself, I have a car. My impression is that the traffic is pretty much back to normal outside of the core. Certainly on like 3rd Avenue and 86th Street, it's back to everywhere that it used to be. So I wonder whether we should be careful as a community board of focusing very narrowly on what could go wrong and failing to see the benefits of the change that could take place. And just frankly, I think the fact that the resolution passed by this task force was overwhelmingly rejected by the full board should raise questions about the kinds of things that this task force is investigating versus the general sense of the full board. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, certainly that should be potential benefits of any discussion. I don't know about the parking, and I think it's hard to judge anything, and it's certainly worth looking into. I've read that when they put a toll on the Henry Hudson Bridge, that traffic on the Broadway Bridge increased enormously. So I just don't know, and I think it's hard to tell, but it raises a lot of questions.
And I'll just add, that was the philosophy behind the original congestion pricing approach that was proposed by Sam Schwartz back in the Bloomberg administration, which was to toll essentially all bridges coming into Manhattan and toll all other bridges in the city at a lower rate to create a more equitable solution where you wouldn't be providing some people with the ability to circumvent the toll. So it's not surprising if people did divert from the Henry Hudson Bridge to the Broadway Bridge, because it's like whenever on the occasions that I drive out of the city to the north, I don't take the Triborough Bridge, I take the Willis Avenue Bridge and 3rd Avenue Bridge, just like anyone knowledgeable would do. But that's not going to happen if you're tolling the entire zone. And I think we've had this discussion at length about, I know people fundamentally disagree about the potential issues of traffic and people coming in and parking short of the zone. I don't know that it would be productive to have that. I think my only point with parking before was that naturally there are going to be some impacts as a result of the implementation of the boundary itself, and therefore it could change some behaviors for those that may be going just to the areas across the boundary as opposed to far in, especially for deliveries and small businesses. And I think that's a discussion that certainly is worth having, putting aside the environmental questions. And I agree about, at least myself, with the environmental benefits with this. But I think, again, since you're new on this board, the intent of this of this task force was to just try to get a handle on what the implementation was going to be like, and trying to ensure that our concerns as a community collectively are being addressed.
Right. And since I convened this task force, Craig is exactly right. That was the idea, which was to make sure that we were being heard. It was alarming to believe that there might be that Manhattan might not be represented on that traffic mobility review board, and that we would have perhaps different concerns, not all of them, but some of them, than the areas to the south, which are in the zone, and to make sure that our concerns were being addressed. And we had enough information from the state, from the MTA, to be able to raise the questions and examine them, even if we don't have all of the answers, because I don't think anyone does. New York is not London. It's not any other city. Maybe partial to New York, but there are things about it that are different. So that's the point. And it's not to say that congestion pricing is good or bad. I think we each have our own opinion, but to raise the issues and make sure that they've been considered, at least, or will be considered by those in Albany. Craig?
I guess, Michelle, you want to comment?
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Greg. My hand had been up prior to, these few comments, yours and Alita's, and our newest board member. So I'll take that into consideration in my new comments. But what I was going to say is, if you had an appetite tonight, and I realize I can't really make the resolution if I speak to it, but if you had an appetite to propose a resolution tonight, just asking that this be postponed until we have more benchmarks as to the resiliency of the city and how it's coming back. If we had certain benchmarks that we were looking for, I don't know that we can enumerate them tonight, but certain things that would really statistically give us an indication of what this recovery is. I think that in the fall, while you might see a change and an increase in people to go to offices, I don't think you're going to get anything next to normal until the whole school situation is sorted out. And I don't mean only with school resuming, but also with the school after school programs. It's still very, very erratic. Some kids were in school 5 days a week for the past couple of months. Others are still on Zoom. There were no after school activities. That played a huge role on whether or not parents would go back to work or leave the home. And until we know for sure that the schools are behaving normally with the after school programs as well, I don't think we'll really know what will happen in this city. But anyway, that could only be one of the benchmarks. I'm sure there are many. And I think a general resolution that would just say that we're asking for caution in implementation. We're not voicing an opinion. We already did that as to whether or not we're for it or we're opposed to it, but just that we're putting out, some caution for implementation, not to rush along too quickly. A board hasn't even been chosen yet. You're in the middle of changing an administration. So there are an awful lot of variables here. And I think that such a resolution, a broad resolution, would be very helpful if the co-chairs have an appetite for it.
Craig, what you thinking?
I think Michelle knows very well that I would not be supportive of that myself. So I don't want to
Let me
unilateral decision. I was just going to say, more broadly than my opinion, I do have a concern that if we keep on trying to put forward resolutions that seemingly are trying to prevent congestion pricing from moving forward, it's going to perhaps bite us in the future.
Well, sorry, I happen to be unmuted, so I will, jump in here. But Yeah, I think look, as much it pained me to hear Rit describe the failure of the other resolution as overwhelmingly opposed, but the reality is it did not pass. So it seems to me that, to Craig's point, at this point, I think we're sort of past taking a position on it. I think, Michelle, I appreciate the sort of neutral way in which you're sort of framing this, but I think fundamentally the sort of question of whether you think it should be delayed or not is kind of going to come down to, if you think it's good, you want it to be delayed, or sorry, if you think congestion pricing is bad, you want it to be delayed, and if you think congestion pricing is good, you probably don't. And I do think it's sort of a bit of essentially a proxy for the same issue that's already been discussed. And I will just go back to the other point, which is to say that very little is sort of imminent on the horizon with it. And so again, I just think from a sort of credibility perspective, to say like we really need this to slow down when in fact very little as yet is taking place, and the best estimate that we have of what the timing of this is 18 months. So I think until at a minimum, until we actually know that it's coming soon, to say slow down, I mean, slow down from what? Enough, there is nothing.
No.
happening.
I take your point, Russell, and I think that's perfectly fine. That's why I said if there was an appetite for this. My concern is I don't want it to be implemented early enough where it plays a role in inhibiting recovery. That's why I was looking for benchmarks. But it's fine. I mean, if there's no appetite for that, but that was my rationale. I mean, I think it's going to take more than a few tourists coming to town, to really get things back to normal. And I just wouldn't want this to be implemented prematurely and then end up being an inhibitor to the city getting back. That was really my point. But I take your point.
I would like to just add that a delay in order to allow the city to recover, when we've seen the impact that these fees have had on taxis, for instance, is not a question of whether you like it or whether you don't, but I am wary about another, I guess, overruling, if you will, by the full board, and also credibility in Albany. So I think that there are other issues we could address, such as parking and such as even just fares, fees rather, on livery services versus taxi cabs, and what's fair and what's reasonable, and how fees should be assessed given the way the senator described it. Does the first person pay the whole fee? Does the last person at night pay no fee? How does that all work out? And what happens with surge pricing and the idea that taxis are disappearing? And I think those are really important questions, because a lot of people do get around by taxi or hire cars, and it's not right to do something that benefits maybe the Ubers and the Lyfts, if I'm just going to express my opinion, which I guess I am. So I think there are plenty of issues, and that if we weigh in on specifics and then see what happens with timing, that we will have the credibility, and we'll also have the ability to discuss things factually, see what missing data there is, which a member of the public raised, and what we may need, and see where the holes are and what may impact us differently than, let's say, below 60th Street. And we should also, Craig, try and figure out what, if anything, CB7 has said about this, because they're in our position on the other side of the park, for those who don't know.
Yes,
Can I-
I've heard anything from CB7, yeah.
One other suggestion I think I would make, and it came up. I mean, one of the great things I think about this meeting is I've personally learned a huge amount just from having Liz tell us about what's going on and what's coming. And I think we want to make sure that we are providing input from our district and input from Manhattan into how this is going to be implemented. But I also think that one of the really useful things that this task force can do is to be a conduit for information and a conduit for fact finding. And just to take one sort of example, a lot of us I frankly have no idea what the impacts have been in London. I just don't know. And I think some people have some idea of it. And I think people to varying degrees are more knowledgeable about it than others. But, for example, just to sort of find out what's been going on there, and in general, I think on a lot of these issues that are going to come up, for example, even the parking issue and a lot of these things, there's a lot of information that this task force, I think the board could potentially get from people with expertise on these subjects. And I think there would be a real benefit to having people come in and sort of talk about what the different possible approaches are. And this is not to say that this isn't what you guys are planning, but this is just my thoughts on it in terms of what the sort of options are or what's optimal from different sort of perspectives. And also, again, historically, what have been the effects.
So I really like that idea, except for one concern that I have, which is that in this polarized society that we live in, but just like with everything else, with congestion pricing, your perspective sort of colors how you view even places like London. If someone is more apt to support congestion pricing as a concept, they'll certainly point to whether it be the environmental benefits. One of the major improvements in London has been to bus speeds. It's had a tremendous impact on buses and some of the pedestrianization that's taken place in London. You'll have other people who are in the other camp really highlight what they view as some of the negative aspects of it is in terms of the economic impacts and such. So I think I would, if we had a way of assuring that you'd have someone who'd be able to really stay as neutral as possible and provide just the facts.
I think, yeah.
I just don't know.
I don't think that's a reason not to do that, because we have plenty of outspoken people in the public and on the board who could ask the questions of whoever is presenting on behalf of another city where there has been congestion pricing. But I think it could at least, even if we don't agree, and even if we think that they're biased, it could at least raise some subject areas that we might want to weigh in on for Albany, or at least ask questions, because, well, I, for one, believe in asking questions, even if you don't have the answers, to help generate some thinking and maybe point in different directions. So if we have someone talking about the impact on parking and outlying in the adjacent areas in London, then we know maybe what they've done, and maybe residential parking works there, permits, and it wouldn't work here. We had a discussion on that last time, but at least it gives us some idea, some experience to draw on whether or not we agree with it. So if we could find people in the different cities or jurisdictions, then I think that would be a good first step. That would be my vote.
I think it would be great. I think there would definitely need to be some homework to try to find someone appropriate. There is one person that I have in mind who's doctoral candidate at Columbia University, who I met at a conference, who's done a lot of work and focused her studies on congestion pricing. I don't know if I could find her information and reach out to her if she would have an interest in providing that perspective. I don't know if she would be viewed as enough of an expert, but that's just one thought I had.
We could figure out particulars offline too, Craig, if this is a way to
Yeah,
go.
we don't have to do all this. It's true.
No, right, obviously. And if we were able to find someone from, say, London or Stockholm or somewhere else who is awake during our meeting hours, that would be great as well.
Yeah,
Hey,
that's a problem. We may want to
can I-
change meeting hours then, or have a pre-recorded
You
conversation.
could do an afternoon thing. Yeah. And you guys have some hands up. I see ribbons.
Yeah, can I offer, so just by way of background, so I was one of the key people who put together Mayor Bloomberg's proposal for congestion pricing when I was in City Hall. And as part of that, I did a pretty detailed set of trips to London to understand what was going on over there. I could certainly ask a couple of people I know in London to do a briefing like this. There was Graham Craig, who was actually the person who set it up. There are a number of other folks, the former head of transport for London. I might also be able to get to talk to us. There is a great deal of information, though. One of the wonderful things about Transport for London is they publish an extraordinarily detailed and introspective report on the impacts every year. Craig, it sounds like you've probably seen this. We could do that. And then there are a bunch of people here in New York, obviously Sam Schwartz, who I know presented to Transportation a couple of weeks ago, Bruce Schaller, the former deputy commissioner under Jeanette Sada-Khan, also has written a number of articles looking at congestion pricing in global context. So those are a couple of things, and I'd be very happy to try to help with that.
And Bruce Schaller is a taxi expert, so he may have some insight as to that piece of it as well.
Okay, well, let's figure this out at another time then, but I think that might be a good first step.
You have a hand up from
Next step, Wendy. Will, would you unmute Wendy, please? Thanks.
Go ahead.
Hey,
Wendy.
thanks for this. Thank you for the second bite at the apple here. I just wanted to say that there are so many good points raised by, I'm going to say all sides instead of, both sides, because I don't want to be so polarized. But the questions raised still lead back to my point about data. And perhaps we could have a resolution on what kinds of answers we actually want, what kind of data is going to help us to understand what's really happening. I don't know whether congestion pricing really encourages, a huge shift in people taking public transportation. I think safety in terms of policing actions and safety in terms of medically safe, are you going to get sick in an indoor space, are the questions that most riders really want answered. I adore taking public transportation. It's so much more convenient, quick, and cheap, and all of that. So I think a lot of people who need to get into Midtown would feel similarly, but those questions need to be answered. But the other questions that we have about economic effects and parking and stresses on particular streets and those questions, those are things that where we could collect, and pollution, we could be collecting data, and a resolution that would enumerate the kind of data that we would like to be able to consider is not out of line to actually make an informed decision. So now, thank you for giving me my extra shot. And that's what I wanted to propose, to have a resolution of specifically the kind of data that we need to evaluate, rather than sort of opining whether it looks like there's more traffic here, or it looks like it's back to normal, or it's not back to normal, or some such. Thank you.
Well, you raise a good point in terms of the issue of public transportation is complicated, because certainly safety seems to be paramount. And that's just, it's complicated, I guess.
And I'll just add that the legislation itself actually, and the timing may not be ideal to some, but the city will study the impact of tolling on parking within 18 months of the start of the tolling program, in addition to the traffic study that's supposed to take place in advance of the implementation of this. So the law does call for actual studies to take place that you would have to imagine would include a substantial data collection element to them.
I would hope that they would be independently conducted, because I think that if the MTA is conducting it and they want to put this plan into place because they see a revenue stream, of course it's going to come out however it's favorable. And similarly, if some anti-group is in control of the data, then you can expect all the data to be skewed the other way. So I'm really looking for some sort of neutral, like real good hard data as what we're really looking at. That may be hard to do, but that's a resolution.
We can ask for information without a resolution. I think I agree that we need data, but I just don't think it's something that requires a resolution to do it. I think we just get it. We just ask.
And Craig, you raised at the last meeting the idea that there were supposed to be traffic studies already done, I think. Did you know?
Right. So I'm just pulling up my notes again. The law.
The law hasn't been satisfied, at least as of last month.
Right. The law requires a traffic study. This is what I pulled from the legislation. A traffic study, including the central business district and surrounding areas, to be performed by the Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Authority and provided to the Traffic Mobility Review Board for the purposes of allowing them to make recommendations regarding credits, discounts, and other exemptions. And that would obviously take place before it were to go into effect. And then afterwards, they would do a study, the city would study the impact of tolling on parking and provide the study to state legislators and the governor. But clearly, and I alluded to this when I was providing my closing comments to Senator Krueger, I think one of our most pressing questions is, what is the status of this traffic study that's going to really be the driving force for the Traffic Mobility Review Board? has it even begun? And is there anyone who could give us any information and status reports? And that's why I was asking, who is the TBTA reporting to, and who would we be able to get such a status update from? And that will give us also a sense of just how far out are we from potentially seeing the Traffic Mobility Review Board from being able to convene, if they're even formed, to be able to even make these decisions and have an open and public, transparent process.
Well, in terms of transparency, they have already, I understand there have been discussions about complying with the open meetings law. Originally, I think before the pandemic, they were going to be meeting behind closed doors, which was an issue for state legislators. So there's that too. And if the traffic study, and I don't know anything about this, has not yet started, how quickly can it be done in order to provide information to the decision makers?
Right. So once again, I think if we can somehow determine, and if anyone present here has any connections where they may be able to find out if there's a certain person or unit within the TBTA or DOT that would be willing to speak to us and provide us with updates, that would be really helpful.
I think if people do, let's have them to, they can provide it either to us directly or through Will. I would say logistical stuff like that, we can do offline. I think we can.
Yeah.
Well, then with that, I think we have some ideas for the next meeting. Craig, you and I should talk and figure out where we want to go. No pun intended.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, and if you have information, if you have sources, if you have ideas, please send them to info@CB8M or Gmail. info@CB8M for Manhattan.com, and the information will get to Craig and me and help formulate or inform where our July meeting should go. So,
and you guys should follow up with Red, I would say also. So.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, no, he sounds like he has a wealth of information, so that's good. Michelle?
Move to adjourn.
Second.
All right, very good. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. And this is really valuable. So very much, this is great. All